+1 tickets? Anybody have +1 tickets that did not pick it up for registration yet? Okay, good. This is not one of the theaters that the movie's going to be in, so you'll want to move to one of the ones with the Avengers logo after this session. Okay, that's it.
No, wow, I thought I had a little more time to prepare for you folks. Hi everybody, how's it going?
Good.
A little sleepy, yeah. I was glad you guys stayed so late this afternoon. Just to straight up before we get too deep into this is a nerdy ass talk. So you have, oh, well, then you don't have my apologies. So we're going to review some fundamentals, but let's kind of look at how cool that is, right? Ooh. If anybody has motion sickness. All right, so just very quickly, I work at a company called Anito. I'm supposed to talk a lot about their products, but my boss isn't here. No, for real, we do some continuous delivery solutions. I'd love for you to stop by our website, check us out. But my role on that team is I was brought up a designer and did some front-end sort of development. I mean, very, very light on the actual development, just HTML, CSS. But as I've been there for a while, I now have a small team of designers, and I work with our back-end devs for our actual applications and help to design UIs and assess UX from both a designer's perspective and kind of hoping to, I guess, blend those teams a little bit. When I get off work, as we all do, I go home, and every Tuesday, I wind up sitting down and pretending to be a dwarf. Hence the Dungeons and Dragons. And so, you know, that's kind of my off the clock job is killing elves and, you know, plundering tombs and that sort of thing. And what that kind of grew up in is, these are funny. Look, this is what I look like. Also, more like this. I love those slides. But with that sort of love of games, not just Dungeons and Dragons, but all sorts of board games, card games, what it sort of led to was a little bit last year. I think one or two of you seem familiar. Our company did a branding awareness campaign, and we made a card game. So we made a little card game about software called Release. I got decks of it. I'll throw them at people later, provided you can catch. Or you'll just have red marks on your foreheads. And that kind of took off in a way that we didn't expect. And so I started this hobbyist company where I actually wind up designing games, which kind of, as it turns out, has a lot in connection that you might not expect. There's a little bit of overlap in between how we play a game and how we play, or how we design and utilize software. Oh, this is us playing games, so that's cool. Dog. So what? You're telling me Dungeons and Dragons isn't a software, except the Dungeons and Dragons software that does exist, but you get my drift. Monopoly isn't a computer program. They aren't. We're not saying they are, but what they are is systems. And as we are moving through those systems, we need to learn how to navigate them, and our users need to learn how to navigate them. And there's a lot of usability that's inherent in games. More so, in fact, than in software, in my humble impression. You see, because software does have back-end devs. It does have stuff that it does. You know, there are all sorts of things that take that give usability a back seat. So software that isn't usable, well, isn't very usable, still can function. Whereas games rely almost entirely, if not entirely, on usability. So if people can't use your game, well, there's no point to actually playing it. So that brings us to a very quick summing up of what UX is. User experience, it's very simple. How a system deals with the behavior, the aptitude, and the attitude of your users. You're going to hear me talking about this a lot, and the specifics of these. So just very quickly, how they move about your system, how educated they become or are in your system, and how fucking happy they are, because that matters. A lot of times we take a step back and we think, oh, it doesn't matter how they're feeling, but I mean, have any of you tried to work with a program that you just don't like? No, you don't try. You switch to another program. Nerds of all ilk, be they software developers, designers, users, or board game folks, are aggressively partisan. And that's something that we have to continue. So if people don't like using your software, it's as good as broken, in my opinion. So again, back to games. Games, they have a visual interface. Be that as simple as a card or a dice that displays numbers, or a rule booklet, a board, etc. Every game's a little different. And indeed, the way people play games from user to user within the game also is different. So you need to really be thinking about those individual usage rules when designing a game. People play them. We have users, just like software. So this is kind of the foundation for why this talk exists, and I won't spend any more time validating myself. You're already sitting here. Thank you. But here's a quick overview of the things that we're actually going to talk about. 4 main concepts. User focus. You've probably heard all about this before. And my focus on user focus is basically reminding us that we aren't our users, and that's a big caveat. Next main section that we'll get into is history. You have to design with the respect for the programs or the systems that came before you, that occupy similar spaces. You want to be innovative, but you've got to do it in proper order. Uniformity is any sort of uniformity. That's iconography, that's keystrokes, that's shortcuts, etc. Making sure that users have a similar experience throughout your system. And of course, rulebooks, which is my clever way of saying documentation. Usability is about establishing intuitive behaviors, but eventually it's not going to work. Your users are going to break your system. They're going to not know what to do. That's just the way it is. So documentation and rulebooks help to guide what happens then. So without further ado, I'm going to get into user focus. Hopefully, you are integrally aware of what your software is. You know intimate details about the whys, the wherefores, and specifically what each piece of your software does. Even if you aren't as intimately familiar as we like to think we are, you understand the internal logic of your system. This works with games too. You can look at a piece of your system, maybe not understand its exact functionality, but you can go back to the core concepts that govern and manage your system and very easily infer what that does. That said, your users don't have that full picture. They just don't. They weren't around for the development. They weren't around for, well, figuring out that you actually needed the solution that you created. This doesn't officially vilify them. I know that it's easy to not have a respect for your users if you're, well, upset at them complaining all the time or not getting things or constantly clogging up your support. But it's important to really, really, really remember, of course, that they're not, well, you. To you, your system is simple. It's a series of obvious moves, and it looks, a lot like this. That said, without proper context, without having things, this is, what the same system could look like to somebody without proper schooling. Also, for somebody who's talking about board games, I am atrocious at chess. I'm the worst, so if anybody wants to win something with me later, you can meet me afterwards and you can kick my ass. More to the point, though, this is what every game of chess anybody's ever played looks like to me. It's just incomprehensible. But again, I'm kind of taking a byline here. This is a pretty obvious statement. UX revolves around users. One very simple way to tell this is it's in the name. Moreover, if you are unfamiliar with 1985, Gould and Lewis wrote a very good piece on basically the foundations of what grew into modern UX. Up here, we only have Clayton Lewis, and there's a very good reason for that. He has great eyebrows. Take a look at these. And that's fantastic. I don't even know, like when it rains. Anyway, so that's Clayton Lewis. Their paper reviewed usability and how to design with usability into 3 very simple parts. First off, early focus on user. This is creating user wish requirements. This is interviewing users. This is having an idea for who's going to be operating your system when there eventually is a system. Second is empirical measurement. That's a fancy way, well, it's a fancy way of saying another fancy thing, analytics, right? Issue tracking, bug reports, etc. Having a way to not just take your users' anecdotal stories, but to really actually measure them and then, of course, iterate on the improvements that you make with that empirical measurements, and as well as some of the anecdotal stuff. So as I said, that's 1985. It's been a while, they've been around. That said, you're going to see things like agile design, DevOps, continuous delivery, et cetera, et cetera. All of these buzzwords revolve around the idea that you want to deploy faster, getting input and being able to take your source, putting it right back into design, accelerating the cycle of releases. So you're still seeing this sort of stuff in all sorts of software methodology today. So with all that in mind, and sorry to cram a whole bunch of complicated software stuff, the next logical progression here is Dungeons & Dragons. Quick raise of hands. How many of you dorks play Dungeons & Dragons? Woo! All right, all right. How many of you have heard of Dungeons & Dragons? How many of you consider us mostly to be Satanists or abject nerds that have no respect for bathing? That guy, yeah. I love how some of the people who played, very similar. So this is a subject near and dear to my heart, so please bear with me. I'm going to talk about D&D real quick. A few of you have heard of it. A lot of you have played it. For those of you who aren't familiar, and for some of you who aren't playing it right, D&D is a system for telling stories. It's a very simple narrative-driven thing, which, as I just had a discussion with, where's that guy? There he is, about, it's very similar to how we think about user experience. But, not to get too much in the metaphor, you have a dungeon master. Most of you have probably heard the phrase. He creates a compelling story, describing, with as little detail as saying, I'm standing in a theater, to describing the, I think those are brocaded fabrics on the wall, the dank lighting, the smell of a whole bunch of developers in one room. I'm just kidding. You guys are great. You guys all smell very nice. It's actually me. So the DM creates a story, and from there the players will navigate through it. How you navigate through that story also affects the story, and it relies on some very simple core mechanics. So for example, if I'm a player, I have a character, and then I say that my character accomplishes something. So while Pat, the first level speaker, is giving his speech, he's going to walk over and grab this bottle of water. Done. That's very simple. That's a simple task, and you guys all saw that happen, and it somehow reflects the story. However, as tasks get more complicated, you have to roll dice. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time with the mechanics of Dungeons & Dragons, but if I wanted to say, Pat throws this in the air, flips it 14 times, catches it on his nose, I absolutely rolled a 1, thank you. Essentially, that's not something you can do super easy, and this time I'm glad I did it with an empty bottle. I was in Louisville earlier this week and just really knocked myself. I didn't. That'd be ridiculous. But so basically, in that case, the dungeon master, or perhaps a nonpartisan rulebook, would designate a number, and then I would roll a dice, and if I rolled over that number, essentially, I would accomplish my task. And if I rolled under that number, what just happened, you would have seen, and it would have been embarrassing for my character and me as a player as well, and me in real life because I just did it. There's more to that, but that's the general mechanic of Dungeons & Dragons. Oh, those are dice because they're cool. You all got some. That's adorable, by the way. Thank you, Star Trek. More to the point of user experience in Dungeons & Dragons. So now you're vaguely familiar with a very simple framework. And that's, at its heart, what Dungeons & Dragons and a lot of role-playing games are. This all started back in 1974 And since then, has had 5 major releases. Let me take you through a little pictorial history. This, of course, is the Red Book. It's beautiful. It's first edition Dungeons and Dragons. Scales up, second edition of Dungeons and Dragons. Third, fourth. Yeah, well, we're actually going to touch on that. And fifth. So you're noticing a lot of changes in design theme. But let's actually talk about fourth edition. Yeah, well, and that's an interesting thing. So, as I mentioned, for those of you who aren't familiar, there is a very simple mechanic that Dungeons & Dragons relies on. That said, it's actually a very complicated game. There's a lot of rules for strange situations, different statistics for how you're going to thwomp a goblin or whatever you do, different spells, et cetera, et cetera. And every so often, they make those updates. As we progress through those updates, Wizards of the Coast, at least in this one, has had different attempts at how they engage their users for the release. And this is, again, about that early user focus. So first off, 4th edition came with a very large overhaul. They kept that core concept, but they changed things in a very big way. They also released all of their handbooks, or at least the core ones, for those that know, wink, wink. They released the core ones in one massive, big marketing thing. So they kept everything secret, and they, instead of releasing slowly where they could iterate on design, they simply pulled back a curtain and they said, here you go. And as you can imagine from the hissing and the booing, it's kind of a flop. Now, does that mean that their system was terrible? You know, again, that's up for debate. As I mentioned, nerds are kind of partisan and willing to be jerks about that partisanship, myself included. But you see, so when they did this, it didn't seem to work. So when we roll around to 5th edition, you have a similar huge overhaul. They retract a lot of the things that they did. They changed their system. They iterate. However, opening up for that, they had a large beta. I believe it was like 2 or 3 years of a beta where everything was open to the public. The users were engaged in how the system worked. They offered feedback. Whether it was taken, that's only part of the equation. The fact is they developed a community that felt like they had a stake in the program, or in the system rather, and then released it to, I think, a pretty resounding critical success. Pun unintentional, but critics liked it, is what I mean. Do any of you other nerds agree with me on that? People like it? Can we get a round of applause for 5th edition? Thank you. I was just kidding. Come on, guys, clapping for D&D. Bunch of nerds. So you can see the obvious difference here. They didn't treat their release as though it was a trick or a marketing gimmick. They engaged their users. They processed feedbacks. They changed that cycle so that rather than having one big shipment, like a waterfall shipment, they released a little more agilely, just to jump back into software terms. And that's because they made assumptions about what their users actually wanted, what they wanted to see. You can see the assumptions in that. Again, not to get too technical on Dungeons & Dragons, but they related back to video games. They looked at other popular fantasy mythoses and artwork styles like World of Warcraft, and they incorporated those things into their system, but all of which makes sense. There's a very logical progression for why that edition came out the way it did, but they didn't ask anybody about it. And so those inferences were incorrect. Just as your users don't have a full understanding of your system, no matter what you do, just trying to logic it out in your brain, you're not going to be able to understand your users and the way they operate with your system. This kind of moves us back to the main concepts from old Lewis and Gould, or Gould and Lewis. You need to engage your users. You need to find out what they want from your system. You need to be able to test how they function through their system, such as in a big beta, or such as having bug reporting. And then you need to be able to process that and spit out a more polished version as quickly as possible. This whole concept, these whole concepts are containers. They help you understand and define what your users really want and what your system should be. They, of course, then track how your users are actually using the system, where bottlenecks appear, etc., and, of course, then help to guide your users. To some degree, 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons might not actually be a better system, but the whole process helped shepherd their users into an area they wanted to. They all felt like they had an investment, a stake in it. So they liked that a lot better. So, very briefly, from this section, we have some key takeaways. You aren't your users. You're just not. God bless you. You know a little bit about your software. You know a little bit about the space you want to be in, but you're never going to know what everybody thinks of you. That's why you have to do testing. Your system's not a gimmick. It shouldn't be a marketing perspective, how you release, when you release. It should be related entirely to your user need, or, of course, then also your resources to do so. And then lastly, it just does. It really, really, honestly does. You're going to get a lot of information from your users. Please respect them. And they will respect you more. They'll like your software better, and then they'll be partisan jerks, but they'll be your partisan jerks. And they'll evangelize you, and they'll support you, and they'll use you even when you're 100% wrong. So let's look at the next big section, history. To differing degrees, we're all craftspeople, excuse me. And we are creating structures, systems, ideas, methodologies, whatever. And we want to make something new. We want to innovate. We want to make our mark on... don't fiddle with your microphone, Patrick. We want to make our mark on our industry. We want to create a new product. But we need to have a respect for the past. I think a fairly reasonable example of this, or not this, is this guy. Let's remove Windows 8 from the context of the Windows that came before it. It's floating in space. It's alone. It is in a vacuum. It's kind of cool. It has a lot of weird, clever tricks. Easy press of the buttons. You can open up programs with just typing their name. It looks fucking cool. I mean, right? It's got bright colors. It's got big font. It looks neat. It looks modern. The commercials were fantastic. I mean, they were nonsensical, but cool people were using it, right? So, but that said, at its heart, Windows 8 actually has a core of usability, but it's not our usability. We hate it, right? I mean, everybody chuckled when they saw that Windows 8 logo. I'm surprised we didn't get more booing and hissing. Now, you won't, because I'm too embarrassed to show you, but you'll see that my computer is actually running Windows 8. That's because my boss is cheap. He just buys whatever's there. But you know, as I've been forced to use it, I've seen some merits to it. Again, I recognize that that's an unpopular opinion, but why is that? Why does what otherwise would be a reasonable system just not work in the public eye, not work based on how people actually want to use it? I'm going to apologize for this term, but it's true. It was supposed to be a pun, then it sounded marketing and gimmicky. You know, it's a game changer, dudes. But it really was. In and of itself, it brought a whole bunch of new ideas to the table, but they didn't really reflect what came before it. So when we're considering how we can implement that in our design, we need to know that you can use an old system to function in new ways. For example, Chutes and Ladders. Obviously, how many of you folks have played Chutes and Ladders? How many of you folks owned a copy growing up or had a friend who owned a copy? Yeah, that's every person in this room. Well, I'm lying, but 90%. We'll do a head count later. Very, very, very successful, okay? It's still a little pricey. If you go and look at it right now, for what the actual production is, somebody's making some money off of that. And by somebody, I mean, what, Milton Bradley, Parker Brothers? Who cares? Everybody use it. Everybody knows what you're talking about when you say Chutes and Ladders. And It's actually been around for a while. None of us are getting any younger, but we all remember it from our childhood. In fact, everybody in this room should remember it from their childhood, or it was around during their childhood, because it is actually really fucking old. Excuse me. I swear sometimes. It was created way back in the 13th century by, I kid you not, a Hindu poet saint named Gindiev. I perhaps mispronounced his actual name, but not his title, which is the coolest thing ever. But he created a version of this, and to be fair, this isn't actually the correct board. This is a later iteration called Snakes and Ladders. But he created a version called Mokshapatam. And this game then eventually came to the Snakes and Ladders that you see in the UK, and then eventually migrated to America and was rebranded as Chutes and Ladders. They function exactly the same. It's a dice roll race. I believe there were a few people who didn't raise their hand, and just because I love talking about the rules and the core mechanics of games, it's very, very simple. I'm going to sneak back for a moment. You start off here at this one slot. You roll a dice. You move forward, the number on the dice. Occasionally, you move on to this ladder. In Mokshapatam, those ladders are paired with virtues. In this case, this is penitence. That's not right. Dutifulness, excuse me. And then if you are lucky enough to exercise that virtue, you move all the way up to 26. And of course, it's a race to the top. That said, if you fall vice to ridiculous crap like gluttony, and there's debauchery around here somewhere. Luckily, it's very blurry. Or unluckily. If you hit those things, you travel back down the chute in our modern version, or are eaten by a snake and then excreted out lower on the cycle of rebirth. So it's a very simple system. And two very different iterations of it, though, but they have objectives. A game's not just a game, they're useful in certain areas. For example, Chutes and Ladders creates an engaging social environment for children and occasionally adults who want something very simple and relatively mindless to do. Hey, so does Snakes and Ladders, so does Mokshapatam. Chutes also, if anybody is familiar with the education community, when you're in a school and you're teaching a lesson, everything you do has to have a reference to educational standards. Chutes and Ladders actually has a very interesting basic addition, basic math components to it. I mean, counting. We've got to learn it sometimes. Mokshapatam also teaches us stuff. It's slightly more complicated than basic math, but essentially it tells us how to be a good person. So you can see we have the same system. Here's the system, but with a slight rebranding, with design changes, but a respect for the core values that came before it, we have wildly different results. And that's kind of the point I'm trying to make when we go to software. When you're designing your systems, you have to remember that your users operate in history. History is not just the programs that came before you, but it's the ones that share a similar space, your competitors, anyone. You have to appreciate what they see as the proper way to do things. Again, this is merging a little bit with our earlier points on user focus, but is no less important. Similar software should have similar UIs, or at the very least, if you make an innovation, you need to instruct folks exactly how that innovation works, and then let them work on it through there. And this is really just a dumb bullet point, but I liked saying you don't have to reinvent the dice. So that's there. Hope everybody appreciates the little bit of kitsch. We're going to move on to our next major subject, uniformity. Now, this is going to also resonate a little bit with what we just talked about in regards to history, but uniformity helps keep engagement with your users. Oh, excuse me. I should explain what I mean by uniformity. Stuff that looks or functions the same. It's very simple. It's keeping consistent design or input elements throughout your systems, be they software or games. If you do so, you will keep folks engaged. The woman who spoke before me, I believe her name was Caitlin, had a very excellent point on this, and she spoke almost exactly what I was going to say about keeping things consistent and how that people don't have to relearn and re-understand each screen, each iteration of your program. She said it much more eloquently than me, and she's not here anymore, so she can't actually hear me compliment her, so that's a shame. But my point is that you're going to create landmarks. Not every element of your software or your system is going to look or function exactly the same, but you need to find places to funnel your users to. Key elements, be they, again, design, input, or pretty much anything that will help them navigate through your system. Let's take a very inspiring example. We raised our hands for Dungeons & Dragons. Who here has played Magic the Gathering? A lot of wizards here. Planeswalkers, excuse me. Magic the Gathering, for those of, the uninitiated, is a collectible card game. This means, essentially, that if you have excess income, you will be pathetic and spend it on Magic the Gathering like myself. I've spent an unreasonable amount of money on this game, which to my mind shows that it is actually a very successful system. And, oh, not just because I did it, because I'm kind of a dummy, but a lot of you raised your hand and chuckled when I said spending money on it, so I assume that you probably smarter people also have spent a ton of cash on it. It has a lot of rules. Again, at its core, Magic is actually kind of simple. It functions on some very standard rules. I won't reiterate what they are, but again, think back to Dungeons & Dragons that had that very simple core mechanic and then complicated it, but kept everything coming back to that same dice roll. In Magic, you do have tons of these rules. That said, it's actually been around since the early 90s. And one important point is, you're wondering, why does the back of a Magic card look like it came from the 1990s? That's because it did. Every Magic card, every part of this system, needs to be able to function with every part of its system that came all the way back from 1990. So you need to keep a lot of the design principles the same. So one landmark about Magic is the back of the cards. That seems very obvious, but it's the same on each card and will be until Wizards of the Coast runs out of money, which, by the way, they're never going to, if only because of me. So there are, over that time period, they've released an unlikely amount of cards, an unreasonable amount of cards. And each of those cards, every time they introduce new elements to their system, they come with new rules. So you can see over here you have this means something, that means something, this means something. That's awesome, by the way. This is cool, this is cool. All of these elements on these cards have a function. Oh, by the way, that's a shirtless and ripped lion man. If you play Magic and you appreciate it as much as I do, you're a nerd. God bless you, but you are a nerd. Oh, that's a zoom in for emphasis on that. So let's put this into practice to identify the landmarks on a Magic card. So right here, you have a card back from the 90s, Giant Growth. Again, I'm not going to explain exactly how it works, but imagine I had a mouse and suddenly he was a car mouse and he was cool. He'd be a lot cooler because he'd be able to murder people better. Only people you don't like, for the most part. I mean, there might be. Anyway, edge case stuff. We don't need to talk about that, Pat. No Magic debates. And then here we have a more modern card from back when I wrote this a couple years ago. So you can see that these cards do look different. There is an update in design. You do have a much more modern, I think currently more pleasing to the eye look on this card. Subtle elements, the background images, et cetera, et cetera. But the main rules of the card, they're always located here. Okay? The cost of the card in-game to play. You need to leverage magical resources in order to enact these terrible and puissant powers. I'm just happy I got to use puissant in front of a group of people. I know what it means, by the way. Yeah. The cost for those spells are listed here. They're always listed here, and they always look fairly similar. The name of the spell, the classification of the spell, is right there. These are all landmarks that trump design changes. Even though you have vastly different looking cards, updated elements, you still come back to these major landmarks, which allows play to stay consistent. Again, at some point, why does this matter? Magic, as I mentioned, has made a lot of money for a lot of people. And more to the point than just the financial success, people love it. It's an important thing. It is, as design evolved, it has retained a level of success. They've added new rules. They've created new looks. And they have not alienated their users, such as we saw with Windows, or any other number of software problems. And what that does, that creates a chronic user. That creates somebody who's willing to come back to your systems, who's willing to look to you as a benchmark for how a system should work and function. It allows you to dominate that sort of space. Also, again, it cost me a lot of money, which is lame. A reflection in software here, this isn't always the case. That it's just, in Magic, as we saw, let's go back for a moment, it's all in how Magic looks, right? There's something to do with the copy, but for the most part, these landmarks are designed, well, through design. Landmarks don't necessarily need to be that case. Did you know that keyboard shortcuts weren't always standard throughout every program? That's not to say they're entirely standard, but you know what Control F does in most things. You know what Control plus or minus does. You know how to use keyboard shortcuts. Not all that long ago, my computer stopped working. Hey, there we go. Wow, that's cool. There were different keyboard shortcuts for different programs, and you needed to have these adorable stickers. I actually had one of those. I look great for my age. You can talk to me about it later. That defined how you did different shortcuts in each program. Nowadays, as we've said, across different UIs, across different systems, across almost entirely unadjacent programs and software, we have the same shortcut keys. So you can find your landmarks almost anywhere. Key takeaways. Uniformity informs a user how to navigate your system. It's like a little adorable map that helps make people go where you want them to go, so they can do the things they want to do in your system. You need to recognize what you want your landmarks to be and what your users are actually defining as those landmarks. Maybe it's something you created, such as in the case of Wizards and their Magic cards and all the design changes they've done there. Maybe it's something that's already in the space in the case of shortcut keys. Also, that joke, again, I can't express enough how expensive they are. They're just cardboard. But we're going to move on aggressively. Rulebooks. This is my cutesy way of talking about documentation. As much as we don't want to admit it, our users will eventually not know how to use our systems. They won't understand a certain element of how things work. Maybe they need a tutorial to get started. They will need your documentation. That's just the case. Oh, and FAQs. One delightful example. If you've noted, I've been pointing out software fails right up in the beginning. In this case, this is a great example of something that had too many words in their documentation. It was clustered, jumbled. That said, it spoke too vaguely or missed certain subjects that were almost definitely going to come up. They couldn't re-release their documentation. Excuse me. They couldn't re-release their documentation. They put it in a format that was only there when you initially bought the system. And it was very vague on certain parts. This, of course, is the famous piece of software called Monopoly. A couple years ago, you might have been involved in email chains or seen somebody Facebook about it, or searched out news about people playing Monopoly on your own if you don't have a life. You're going to learn that you, in fact, don't know how to play Monopoly, at least not as it was intended. Everybody plays it a little differently. Some people have different properties at start. Some people you have to auction every property you land on. Some people you have to go around the board several times before it works. You start off with different amounts of money. Seems like that should be something that is obvious in the rules. What the hell is free parking? I mean, Everybody uses it differently. It also doesn't make any sense in the context that my family did. It was like, oh, I parked for free, and then somebody gives me like $600, which would be cool, IRL. But I could keep talking about this. There are a lot of reasons why everybody plays Monopoly different. That doesn't necessarily make Monopoly unsuccessful. Everybody's played the game. A lot of people love the game. And frankly, all of you have heard it. With every other thing, I asked if you've owned it, played it, heard of it. I didn't even bother with Monopoly. It's incredibly successful. But I would hazard to say that the documentation itself is not, because there's not a consistent experience for how people learn or refer to problems in the system when they arise. As I mentioned, a lot of my work is actually in the design space. Recently, Adobe started, it's not that recent anymore, I suppose, started a service called the Creative Cloud. In this case, you're constantly updating your software. You're constantly getting new versions. You pay a monthly subscription. Included in those updates are tutorials. Every time you start your software, these tutorials pop up. They say, hey, do you want to know about this? It's not annoying, because they're very attractive to look at, and you can very easily click away. They are available in video. They're available on the website, in the forums. They're available in transcripts that you could find. They also are being updated. There's new tutorials whenever they add new features. There's new things just that users have mentioned. It's a great system for how they manage their documentations. What does documentation actually need, though? We talked about a quick failure story, Monopoly documentation. And then we talked about, of course, Adobe's documentation, just like 2 seconds ago. If you forgot that, you're not paying attention to me, and that's OK. It's getting late. You're excited for popcorn and the Hulk or whatever. I'm very handsome, too. Hulk's not handsome. I mean, what's his name is? Anyway, sorry. So as I mentioned, Monopoly is very successful, even though its documentation isn't. At some point, you have to refer to the same principles that you use to direct your software systems to make your documentation systems, because that's what it is. It's a little mini system. As it turns out, Monopoly doesn't actually need a better system. It still sells. People still play it. They still have fun. They accomplish what the users want from the Monopoly documentation, which ostensibly is it doesn't exist, and you just call your parents and ask them how to actually play Monopoly, and they tell you their family rules. Hallmarks of family tradition. That said, Adobe requires a much more extensive and much more usable documentation for designers like myself, and so they've made it available. So that's successful. Why should you not bother with things? Why should Monopoly? Why should Parker Brothers spend a ton of time working on a better rule set for Monopoly when their game already works? It doesn't actually help them out. It doesn't make any sales. It doesn't make their system better, getting away from even the commercial aspect. As it turns out, it does for Adobe. It makes designers better designers. It makes their users more educated on their product. And again, getting back to the economic angle, much more likely to keep paying that monthly subscription because they're not frustrated. I want to draw attention. You guys have all used the Facebook manual, right? You know how to fucking use it. They don't need to take the time. They don't need to make the effort to create documentation. And it works great. So key takeaways on our last bit, Rulebooks. There will be problems. I love you all deeply from the bottom of my heart. Your software isn't going to resonate with everybody. It's not going to be as intuitive as, well, anything. I mean, it's just going to break at some points. To create proper documentation, proper rulebooks, you should refer to the same general principles that we talked about earlier. And I guess with that, let's do a quick wrap-up. It's pretty cool, right? Can we do that one again? All right. So again, just to rewind and go over my major key concepts. User focus, we aren't our users. Don't try to be, but please respect your users. Keep them in mind when you're designing your systems. History. Stuff happened before you, stuff's happening after you, stuff's happening during you. Make sure that you're a part of that. Otherwise, your systems will lack context and therefore be unusable. Uniformity. things are going to have to look, act, feel the same, so people don't have to constantly relearn how to use your systems or navigate through them. And last but not least, you need to create good documentation, just referring to those first three. So rinse and repeat. That in mind, that's my last stomach-jarring slide. So we've reached the end of our presentation. And I'd be happy to take some questions if anybody has. Oh, yes?
You said that you can't create a program that you won't eventually need documentation for it, like that somebody will eventually try to do something. You think is this possible to make a program that people can just always without ever needing to be told how to do it? You can't do it.
Sure, you can't do a game like that. I think that with human conception, absolutely, sure. If you had an infinite amount of resources or an undisclosed amount of time, what you can't do is do that in an economically viable situation. And again, I'm not just talking about money. I'm talking about work hours, effort. It's much easier, and it solves the same problem rather than testing your program till you reach a golden hammer. Well, not a gold. Anyway, to reach a beautiful golden ticket program that would be perfectly usable. Well, at some point, why not invest that in creating better in those hours and that resource in creating a better program in other areas and simply have good documentation which can help support your users and thereby achieve the same thing. Does that make sense? My thoughts on that. Are there any other questions? All right, I knew this would happen. It's a fundamentals talk. Nobody has questions because I just talked about stuff that everybody already knows and said fuck a few times. That said, I mentioned my company came out with some games. So if somebody wants a game, I will whip it at them. But I would require maybe not a question. If you can't think of a question about my talk, tell me about something nerdy that you do. And it can't be like creepy stuff. You know, you guys know exactly what I mean. And that one I will stick to the guys. So who go? Right there, you.
I just got a question. What does the talk have to do with Pinochle?
Oh, yeah, that's a very, very good question. Release the game is modeled after standard trick-taking games, such as Pinochle, Euchre, etc., with a variable scoring mechanic. If you don't receive a copy here today, it's available on Amazon or at anito.com/release. So that's what Pinocle's about, and I like playing it. So, oh man, I'm gonna nail that dude. You can come down and get one eventually. Yeah. Also, the Star Trek guys are asking me not to. You, real quick.
It's a DC 3 for the throw here, so I like.
Yeah. All right. Give me something nerdier than just knowing what a DC is. I mean, that's pretty nerdy.
I started DMing for the first time, and it's way more nerve-wracking than I ever expected. You need to know all of the rules, not just the ones that your character is going to use.
Yeah.
The documentation is far more important when you're that engrossed in it.
Look at this. Also, I would encourage you just to lie to people about whether or not you know the rules. You're the DM. Who cares?
I'm learning.
Yeah. Up there. Yeah, you are. You're the man. Yeah, you.
Timmy, Johnny, or Spike?
What?
Timmy, Johnny, or Spike?
Spike. Yeah, we're gonna do that one too. This one's set aside, and we have one more copy of release. Although I'd encourage you guys all to talk about your Dungeons and Dragons characters with me later. So one more. This guy has been real excited.
Okay, so he's talking about DMing for the first time.
Sure.
I'm just going to mention one nerdy fact. On June 7th of this year, I will have been playing Dungeons and Dragons for 40 years.
That's the absolute longest you could be playing Dungeons and Dragons for. Listen, here you go. This is for your continued commitments of virginity.
I have two daughters in college. They both play in our group.
Well, you can have them call me. Unless anybody else has any other comments. Oh, yeah, what's up?
Brian gave a talk at Code Bash a year or two ago about the gamification of our world.
Yeah.
How do you really see user interface changing with the whole trend of making the user experience more like a game anyway?
Chivos, achievements. First off, it's if you refer back to one of my earlier slides, I talk a lot about attitude. By gamifying things, we make people excited to be there. We increase their happiness. And again, that doesn't seem like something that's as obvious of a takeaway as to how that affects usability, but when you're happy, you're simply more willing to sit and think something through. You're simply more willing to, I guess, make something usable. So I think that, for my money anyway, that's what gamification does. It makes you excited to be checking in on your whatever, specifically for me, a calorie tracker. I get little like, oh, you've eaten 8 vegetables today. You're great. And so like I'm excited to, when as before, chewing those vegetables would have been very hard for me. And in this case, I find vegetables to be much more usable, if that makes any sense. Thank you. Anything else? All right, race for the bathrooms then. If you received a package and I didn't chuck it at you because I'm polite, I will give you one. Oh. A lot of applause.